I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I also feel like a little bit of a fish out of water while I'm adjacent to market design and all kinds of things that I'm working on. I'm a optimization modeler and algorithmicist. And what I want to talk about today is sort of the range of issues that are affecting market design in what I think of as modern urban mobility. And indeed, as Michael already alluded to, this is a space in which the actual how things are done has changed dramatically over the last 15 years. And just sort of give you a sense of the various steps that did actually pick up speed prior to the introduction of the cell phone. But indeed, I agree with Michael that the cell phone is a huge driver. So bike sharing in its sort of current station-based format can really trace the modern setting to two systems in France. In contrast to the e-scooters, News Believe in Paris was certainly really instrumental in sort of waking up the world that this really could happen. And Citi Bike in New York started in 2013, so by now 10 years ago. So that was one big player. The next thing, of course, which Mike already spent a fair amount of time, is ride sharing peer-to-peer. And I'll talk a bit more about that, with Uber starting in 2009, Lyft was founded in 2012, Citi or its ancestors was founded in 2012. Beyond this, bike sharing in its initial format, and very much due to the fact that it predated the cell phone, was station-based, whereas now in newer instantiations, it is now completely allowed to be dockless, though we'll talk a little bit more about the implications of that. And one implication of that is the Chinese experience. And there you see a pile of discarded bikes that just in terms of what it takes to maintain the structure. And you can sort of anticipate why Paris got to what it did. The next extra dimension to this, which comes into play for bike sharing, is the fact that motorized pedal assist bikes are part of the structure. This dates to about 2015 in terms of the initial inception. And of course, one of the important things to realize about an e-bike versus a regular bike is they need the power. And so this changes the nature of what it needs to keep them functional. And then in some sense, the thing that changed popular perception in a variety of ways, both positively and negatively, was the next step was the introduction of scooters. And the variety of cities, how they've coped with this, like a lot of issues that were driven by the tech industry, San Francisco bore the brunt of e-scooters first. They just completely erupted in 2018. And just again, in terms of having a city that tried to take control, they were completely banned within 4 months for the city to take a step back. And they really, even to this date, haven't had the same sort of penetration they had in those brief shining moments in complete chaos in spring of 2018. And of course, this is an industry in which there are far more providers than we've seen in the other spaces. Another element that's come into play is what might be viewed as vertical integration, that think about the way in which all of these components interplay with each other, and that you have companies that are trying to do this, or more thinking about the role of the cell phone and the digital platform overall, is that we're moving to a world where we should be thinking about mobility in the urban setting that says mobility as a service. And so now this is now integrating not only just the private entities that are running all of the various elements that I've talked about, but also the traditional public transport and how they can actually complement each other. So I want to spend a little bit of time just sort of giving you a sense, and partly because where I've spent most of my time thinking about is just sort of what happened in bike sharing in its traditional sense, and give you a sense of some of the challenges that come into play. So bike sharing, I'm sure most of you know this, that you have a collection of stations, there are docks in the station-based thing, that you can rent a bike at any station and return it at any other station in the system, and therein lies the challenge. Your cell phone gives you information like this, which tells you for every station what fraction of the station is actually full, whether there's actually availability of bikes and availability of docks. And indeed, this is in some sense the essence of what makes bike sharing a little different from the usual supply and demand problems, is that one station is controlling both ends of the ride in terms of availability on one side may mean lack of availability on the other, and they're sharing the common resource. And I think it's instructive, and see if I can do this. I'm going to show you. This is a little old, but it gets the point across. This is a day in the life of New York, circa 2015. As you can see, there's a clock at the top. Each of these little circles corresponds to one station in New York. The diameter of the circle will show the net inflow. The color coding will indicate whether it's in or out. The city is just waking up. You see where there's outflow from the transit hubs, from the Port Authority there. Then you see this waking up in the financial district in Midtown as you're seeing mass inflows into those cities. The rush hour is now, morning rush hour is now over. We're sort of fading into a more steady state percolation kind of view. There'll be a little pickup around lunchtime overall. And then as we turn into the afternoon rush, then you'll see the same thing in reverse. You'll see an outflow from Midtown, from the financial district into the transit hubs. And the afternoon rush hour is actually longer and more sustained. People are less pressed for time. They'll do an errand on their way back. And so that you'll have a longer sustained service, and little by little will fade back into the percolation that we saw as we picked up at midnight. So it gives you a sense of the dynamics and the transients that are within the system. And so one basic question, and I'll when I first started working with Citi Bike, actually in sort of 2 owners ago, and I met with the general manager literally on the Friday before they were launching their beta users, and he says, "Well, we have 12,000 docks, and we have 6,000 bikes. So our goal is to start every rush hour with every station half full." And I looked at him and I said, "That isn't what I would have thought would be the right way to do things, but let's talk." And indeed, that is in some sense the interesting question as you think about how the systems are getting used and how we have historical data to actually understand in a very nuanced way, transaction by transaction, what ride is being done from where to when, at what time, and start time and what end time. We really have the means to build good models for what the ideal amount of stock should be for each station. So this is easy to set up in a given model that we can imagine. We can use historical data to consider a Poisson flow of bikes for renters and returners at any given station. This allows us to set up a continuous time markup chain so as to think about the state of the station as being how many bikes are in that station at a given time. And then we can think about the computation of expected stockouts, either from the point of bikes not being available or from the point of view of docks being available over the course of a given planning period, and thinking, let's say, of that over the course of a day. And so this gives us a metric in which we can imagine what the idealized way a station should look. And of course, stations look very different. So if I look at a station outside the Port Authority, this is a plot that shows exactly what the cost function associated with in terms of the expected number of stockouts that occur overall as a function of the number of bikes that are in that station at 6 a.m. We saw already that that's a place where you have immediate arrival of lots of users. In early, you want those stations to be essentially full. So every addition, bike that's not present at 6 a.m. is going to lead to an additional stock out at some point, during the day. That's one extreme cases, but there are a range of different things. Here's a pretty dull station in Brooklyn that it really doesn't matter too much. There isn't a lot of service. You get a curve that looks like that. Midtown, of course, where we saw the great inflow, you want those stations at 6 a.m. to be pretty much empty. And every station is a little bit different, and that allows us to, as I'm thinking about a particular moment in time, I've just focused on 6 a.m. here, what is the idealized, what's a target level for what you want that station to have? And of course, there are neighborhood effects that I'm showing here, 2 different standard neighborhoods that East Village and the financial district. And again, what this is showing is over as a function of the time of day, what is the fraction of the docks available at that station that should be full? So we can actually then see it. But this graph really shows the challenge in that as I evolve through the day, the kind of target threshold changes dramatically overall, that in the morning in the East Village, which is a residential area, you have people that will eventually pick up their bikes and want to go. You want it essentially to be full until people stop going to work. But by the time people are returning from work to that residential area, you then want it to be essentially empty at the point of the returning traffic from rush hour traffic goes. Or in the financial district, symmetrically in the opposite. You want that to be empty at the start of the day so that the people working in the financial district can park their bikes as they arrive. But by the time, but of course you want them then still to be full as they leave. And this is a scatter plot that shows across two dimensions that as I think about what would be ideal at 7 a.m. versus what's ideal about 4 p.m., again, I mean, I've highlighted in the examples that I've shown stations where those ideals are extreme. They want to be completely full in the morning and empty in the afternoon, or vice versa. But as you see across the scatter plot, across the range of stations, the complexity and the nuance of what's ideal across different stations fills, well, not completely. There are clearly parts of the plot that are empty for obvious reasons. But you see the complexity of what it means to manage it. So what I'm trying to impress upon you here is sort of the complexity in just what it is involved in both designing and operating a bike sharing system. How many docks? How many bikes do you want overall? How many docks at every given station? If I think about sort of the ability in a Harry Potter way that I could get the bikes to be wherever they want at 5 a.m. where the city is basically quiet, how many bikes should be positioned initially? This is an optimization problem given the models that we want. We have a limited number of bikes. We have an understanding of the cost that would be good of what it should be there. And we can really understand not just at a station by station level of what's the ideal target, but as I think about system wide, how do I do that allocation? Of course, we also can see that the New York City system for which we've worked extensively, I mean, to give you a sense of the order of magnitude, in summer, monthly, there's something about 4 million rides a month. It doesn't ever go quiet. Even in January, there are something like between 500,000 and 1 million rides in the month. It depends, of course, how much snow there is, which there's less and less over time. So this gives the ability to readapt the system of not just think about allocating bikes, but think about allocating bikes and docks. The docks are actually just heavy pieces of metal that sit on top of the sidewalk. In Paris, in contrast, they're actually on the grid, which caused all kinds of problems when the contract was renewed, and there was a new provider after 10 years. But we can actually adapt the system. How do you think about doing augmentation? How do you think about adding additional stations? All of this data can be used. Now, one of the things that I already mentioned is that this is the old world. This is a station-based system. And how do you actually operate then when you're not having all the bikes parked at a station? And they're natural extensions of how to think about it, but they don't work particularly well. And there's this additional operational consideration of that we now have e-bikes. And in some sense, e-bikes and scooters are equivalent from thinking about how the systems can get run. But how do we actually keep them running in terms of making sure that the charge is available when you want them? And this provides all kinds of challenges as well. And of course, everything is stochastic on the short term. How do you mitigate the imbalances that do occur even across a planning? And one thing to sort of, and now here to connect actually to something that is explicitly market design, is that when we were working with Citi Bike, they were very much tied into a contract with New York City for what the pricing scheme would look like. And this is what it was. It was really geared towards attracting long-term subscribers. It was not being even a price single ride or a day pass. Those was a very small fraction of the traffic. Life has changed substantially in the last few years. And so we didn't have the kinds of tools that all of you in this room would want to use. We wanted a price, that we wanted to say, it's really expensive to take a ride, at 9 a.m. from Penn Station to the financial district because you're using up critical resources at exactly the point that's in sync with everything else. And so what we did is we instituted an alternative currency. Then we instituted an incentive set of points that riders could collect, that you could enroll in being a bike angel, and depending on where you were, that you could either, get a point for renting at a given station and get a point or more points from returning a given station. And so we had a completely dynamically affected map that set up that that users could do that. Our main hope was that we could sort of nudge traffic, that it sort of, as New York is a very heterogeneous area in that you can rapidly transition from things that are more residential to more commercial. And so that if you could just get traffic to shift a little bit, then you could do a lot of mitigating what would happen in terms of moderating demand. At this point, more than half of rebalancing, I mean, one of the dirty secrets of bike sharing is that a lot of, as much as you can market it as a sustainability enduring promoting thing, a lot of energy literally was spent moving bikes from places where there are too many to places where there are too few. And this is a mechanism for building into the market a means for doing that with actually pedal power instead. This was then gamified. And just to give you a sense of the power of gamification in terms of people incentivizing, so there was a leaderboard, and Joe Miller here being at the top of the leaderboard, these are all of the rides that he did in April 2016. So the extent to which this can have an effect was really dramatic in the sense there. Today, more than half of rebalancing is done by bike angels. Overall, this is something that Lyft or actually Motivate, before it was bought out by Lyft, implemented across its systems, even in Montreal, where it's not Bike Angel but SMBC. There, but of course, one of the things which, of course, is near and dear to all of you is how are these incentives, how are these point values created? And this is again ties back exactly into the cost metrics that I was talking about, that we can exactly target them overall in setting this in motion. Let me just take a step back in the last 3 minutes. Let me sort of throw out some wild and speculative things. I want to come back to Michael's, sobering thing about, and I'm drawing the distinction of ride hailing versus ride sharing. I want to talk a little bit about autonomy, and I want to talk a little bit about programmable spaces in my last 3 minutes. Ride hailing versus ride sharing. We just heard in this sort of simplified what's there. Lyft has abandoned ride sharing to go to ride hailing. That Michael set the stage perfectly already for understanding why what I call ride hailing, that is single user, single passenger things, went viral. It was just the right moment of the time. It broke the monopoly of the taxis. It did all of the right things in establishing a market. Right. There's a fundamental question of, is pricing and congestion issues, is ride hailing sustainable? And as pointing to the van questions, what can we do to make ride sharing work? But why is it hard? And this actually is in many ways lying on my shoulders, is that it is really the combinatorics and the optimization of actually doing in a dynamic, time-sensitive way to actually keep cars full. And this is something which neither, at least I can say that Lyft did not get right in the sense of having a large enough investment, but I do think it's solvable. It's just hard as a computational problem. And I think that's where a lot of research will go. And of course, it ties into ultimately the pricing of how these commodities should work. Autonomy. And one important thing in thinking about, what the future will hold is, how soon will autonomous vehicles arrive? I'm actually a pessimist on this. 10 years, maybe, but really 20 years is what I think of as the timeline for when, a substantial fraction of traffic will be autonomously driven vehicles. That isn't to say that I think that there aren't domains in which autonomy will play a role exactly in the space. If you think about how large a bus is and how large a van is, that is in some sense a cost of labor trade-off. And as autonomy can work in different limited settings, this is a setting even within an urban traffic where I see a space of it having an effect. And as we think about public systems where autonomy is used, I mean, BART is largely autonomous. Muni could be much more autonomous than it is as I think about light rail because of the limited interactions that it does. But this also allows us in the kinds of, we all know from renting cars, I don't have a car that does this, that you cross the lane and you get those, the ability to know mild things about how traffic control could work is the sort of thing that we can do. So we could have fancy paint that allows us to have programmable lanes in urban traffic that sets aside bus lanes, bike lanes, different kinds of traffic, and all of these kinds of things interacts with autonomy in a way that I do think can happen in the next 10 years. And then, of course, sets up new markets for all of how we actually price what it takes to do this and what it means from the system side. I do think that this, the small synchronized shuttle kind of model is the kind of thing that has, I think, that as you think about the road space, that we now will have the potential of what I'll call reconfigurable roads that will allow for congestion pricing in interesting ways. And even more broadly, as we think about what happened to sidewalks and pieces of roads in the pandemic, we'll have the potential for sort of reconfigurable urban spaces that allow us to have different resources across the public space overall to be used by different commodities altogether. And with that, I'll leave it to